Listen, I'm not saying that Pathfinder is objectively the better game. All I'm doing is pointing out that the players in my home game will actually get to level up to level 14 sometime around Christmas this year. Was that joke too mean for the internet? I'm not sure. Today, I'd like to talk about some of the advantages associated with complex mechanics in tabletop RPGs on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, the joke's on you. I was already a helpless math nerd long before I picked up anything written by Paizo. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and today, welcome to a defense of complex mechanics in tabletop RPGs, where I want to take a look at some of the advantages that come with crunchier game design at the gaming table. Now, fans of this channel already know that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is my favorite tabletop RPG. I have played a number of games through the years, and I enjoy a wide variety of games, yet Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a game that has landed very solidly at the top of the pile for me, and it's a game that I feel really stands out among the various options that I've tried. However, despite all of the reasons that I have to love Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I am quite aware of the various arguments that run around the internet, especially between members of the Pathfinder and D&D communities, where people get into, let's be honest, some pretty heated discussions about which game is the superior game and why. Fans of Dungeons & Dragons are often quick to criticize Pathfinder as being unnecessarily complex, difficult to approach for new players, and in an effort to give me easy clickbait titles for my videos, they will often throw out monikers like Mathfinder as a way to attribute a nightmarish degree of complexity to my favorite game. Not to be outdone in the internet salt department, fans of Pathfinder will often fire back, deriding fans of Dungeons & Dragons for playing a childish game or an overly simplified game, or maybe even insulting the intelligence of people who play the game. And I do want to make clear up front for this video that the goal of this video series is not to insult a fan of any particular game. Yes, I'm going to be talking about Pathfinder and D&D a lot because that's kind of the world that this channel lives in, but honestly this discussion goes well beyond the scope of just D&D and Pathfinder. It covers a wide variety of TTRPGs, and I think most sensible people in the gaming industry know and understand that if you and your friends are sitting around a table and throwing dice and having a good time doing it, you're doing it right. If you're having fun, that's the most important thing. Still, I do think it's interesting to dissect, to analyze some of the design decisions that game publishers make, because talented, intelligent, and creative individuals often come to wildly different decisions about how to handle particular aspects of their game. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I actually posted a question on my community page here on YouTube comparing simple and complex mechanics in TTRPGs to the hard magic and soft magic distinction that you will sometimes see in the fantasy novel world. But as I began to dig into the discussions that question represented, I realized that I had kind of hit upon a much bigger topic than I originally anticipated. So allow me to say that the Mathfinder series of videos I'm getting ready to do It's going to be a series. There's going to be at least a part 2 to this video, possibly a part 3, and who knows, depending on the feedback I get from the community, this conversation might go much farther than I originally planned. But essentially, what I set out to do was to explore why people might want to play complex games. Personally, I really love Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I admit that it's a more complex game, but I also really enjoy playing it and prefer it over other games. And so this video is going to be an exploration of what are the positives of playing a TTRPG that uses complex mechanics. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas here, and I think this conversation is going to go a lot of interesting places. And yes, that is a natural lead-in to the YouTube stuff that's in every video, which is, I want you to be part of this conversation. I want you to jump down to the comments section, leave your thoughts and ideas about why complex mechanics might be appealing to TTRPG players. And while you're doing that, if you want to leave a like or share the video or even subscribe to the channel, by all means do so. And if you'd like to be more involved with the Disaster Tour Guide community, you can also check out my free Discord and my Patreon, both of which are linked in the video description. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Now for this video, I would like to offer 5 specific benefits that I think complex mechanics lend to a tabletop RPG. But before I dive into those, I'd like to offer 3 caveats real quick. Caveat number 1 is, in this video I'm not discussing the weaknesses of complex mechanics. There are some natural disadvantages to using complex mechanics in TTRPG design, but this topic is already getting pretty big pretty fast, so if I visit that subject, I'll probably do that in a future video. The second caveat I'd like to note here is that simple and complex are relative terms, and as we have this discussion, that is important to keep in mind. For example, saying that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a complex game is true if you're comparing it to, say, Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, but it's not actually true if you're comparing it to Pathfinder 1st Edition, or maybe another game like Shadowrun. When we talk about the spectrum of simple mechanics and complex mechanics, where a game falls is ultimately going to be relative to other games inside of the industry, and that relativity is important to keep in mind when you're having the conversation, to say nothing of the tangent that sometimes even mechanics inside a particular game may be simple or complex relative to other mechanics in the same game. I'm looking at you, pre-remaster refocus activity. And then the third and final caveat I'd like to offer to the conversation is this. I think the most important takeaway of this entire conversation is that regardless of simple or complex, when we look at choices in game design, the number one thing we should always remember is that the mechanics of the game should serve the game and the story, not the other way around. The mechanics are there to support the narrative, to support the story, to support the game, and if a mechanic is not supporting one of those things, then it's not needed, regardless of how simple or complex a given mechanic may be. Still, with those general ideas out of the way, I do think there are some clear advantages that come from using more mechanically complex ideas inside of your game. If you've been in any nerdy hobby for any length of time, you know that arguments about terminology are kind of one of the bad habits that our sphere has. Vague rules, unclear language, I don't care what game you're talking about. When you have indistinct ideas inside of your product, it does take away from the enjoyment of that particular game, regardless of if it's a card game, a board game, a video game, or in this conversation, a TTRPG. Clarity is a good thing for all participants involved. It makes a game easier to understand, it makes a game easier to manage. When I used to run Dungeons & Dragons all the time, as a storyteller, I had a hard and fast rule that I only ran 1 combat encounter per game, and very, very rarely would I run 2 combat encounters, because combat was just so slow that I rarely had enough time to fit more than 1 fight in a particular session. However, when I started running Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I quickly discovered that I could routinely include 2 fights in a game, and sometimes I could even squeeze in 3 fights per session, and part of the reason for that was the mechanical clarity of the system just allowed me as the storyteller to run the game very smoothly and very quickly. There may be a learning curve that comes with mechanical complexity, but that same mechanical complexity also provides a lot of mechanical clarity, and when you have clarity, that is an advantage to playing the game smoothly and quickly, which is a positive that comes with this particular type of approach to designing your rules. The second advantage that comes from complex mechanics is narrative depth. Now, this may seem a little surprising at first glance. Oftentimes we think of simple games as being more story-focused, but one of the interesting things about mechanical complexity is that it makes things more meaningful. Quick example, let's take a look at the ABCs of character creation in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Ancestry, background, and class. Each of those steps in character creation come with distinct mechanical advantages that your character will have. Now, Pathfinder is far from the first game to include these elements, but I remember playing plenty of old RPGs where a character would have a background, but that background didn't mean anything inside of the game unless you as a player decided to make it mean something. I rolled up plenty of characters in D&D 3.0 and 3.5 who invested a certain number of skill points outside of their class skills because that reflected the story that I gave the character. We've been giving layers and depths to characters in TTRPGs for decades now, but the idea that different aspects of your character have mechanical meaning inside the game is honestly a good thing. When I tell you that I am playing a dwarf in Pathfinder, that has a particular meaning inside the game and opens up certain options. If I tell you that that dwarf also has the acolyte background and is a member of the psychic class, again, there are real tangible benefits to those things. If I tell you that that same dwarf runs around in a red shirt, well, that doesn't mean anything. Unless he drops into a Star Trek game. It's okay, Starfinder 2E's not out yet. This is honestly a tangent that you could chase many different directions, but the simple truth is this: when you have complex mechanics inside of a game, you are creating an opportunity for those mechanics to intersect with the story in a meaningful way at just a wider variety of points. And let's be honest, as gamers, yes, it's fun to be creative, but when that creativity is then rewarded with a meaning inside of the game we're playing, that is something that we do find more engaging. And this leads nicely to my next point. Another advantage of complex mechanics is that they actually give you more opportunity for narrative creativity. By having complex mechanical options inside the game, it can provide more nuance and more meaning inside of your story. And to use an example that I've discussed before on this channel, this is an example of why I prefer Pathfinder's Fortune and Misfortune to D&D 5e's Advantage and Disadvantage. Now, mechanically, Advantage and Disadvantage in D&D 5e and Fortune and Misfortune in Pathfinder 2e are extremely similar. In the vast majority of cases, they mean roll 2 dice and either take the better dice or the worse dice, depending on the particular effect. However, the distinction that I'm highlighting here is, in D&D 5e, Advantage and Disadvantage applies to all kinds of things. Advantage could be a lot of things. You could be benefiting from some kind of luck charm, or maybe you have flanking against your opponent, or maybe one of your allies cast an entirely not broken spell from the College of Strixhaven. When we go over to Pathfinder 2e, that mechanic of rolling 2 dice and taking either the higher or the lower doesn't have the same narrative breadth that Advantage and Disadvantage has in D&D 5e. In Pathfinder 2e, it's Fortune and Misfortune. Good luck or bad luck. And so what that means is, in Pathfinder 2e, as a result of its mechanical complexity, if you introduce an element to the game that involves rolling multiple dice and then picking one, you are immediately telling the players of the game something about the narrative of what's going on. In other words, this is a luck effect. This is essentially an expansion on that very first point I made about clarity, because the storyteller and players understand that rolling multiple dice is a fortune or misfortune effect. When they see that come up in the game, they immediately understand something that's happening inside of the story, and it immediately creates something inside of the story that players can engage with. Now, to be entirely fair here, there are some ways that simple mechanics also can serve the larger story that players might be trying to tell, but I do think it's worth pushing back against this generalized narrative that simple mechanics are all about the story, when the reality is complex mechanics can actually feed the story and serve the story in some pretty powerful ways. But now I want to switch gears a little bit, because when we talk about tabletop RPGs, a TTRPG is more than just a story. It's also a game. And this is where I think a lot of the conversations around game designs in general start to shift towards the Pathfinder side of the scale. When you look at the game aspect of tabletop role-playing game, complex mechanics do have a lot of advantages, and one of them is game balance. There is a very real likelihood that the main reason that I am biased in favor of Pathfinder 2nd Edition can be summarized entirely in the encounter building rules for monsters work. The math of the game has been finely tuned enough that a severe encounter is actually a severe encounter, and if I open up a bestiary and use the monsters in that bestiary the way the game intends them to be used, they're going to do what they're supposed to do. Complex mechanics allow for multiple points of control of the game aspect of a tabletop role-playing game, and when you have those multiple points of control, it creates a variety of ways to adjust the experience so that the game overall just balances out and runs smoother. In a way, this feels like another expansion on the idea of clarity that we've already discussed. The complex interworking parts of Pathfinder 2nd Edition are balanced in a way that the game runs itself really smoothly, and it leads to a pretty positive game experience. But on top of that, when you have complex mechanics, it also means that it's a lot easier to address situations where something is unbalanced. Some of you may remember the dreadfully overpowered weapon in Pathfinder 2nd Edition known as the Gnome Flick Mace. And some of you may remember that Paizo was forced to nerf its overall power level to bring it back into compliance with the intended parameters of the game. And the reality is, Pathfinder's nerf of the Gnome Flick Mace is a lot less drastic than the way most tables have responded to silvery barbs in the D&D 5e sphere. In both instances, you had an option that was clearly mechanically superior to other options in the game. It was clearly more powerful than it should have been, but in Pathfinder 2e, the fix to the imbalance was relatively simple, whereas in D&D 5e, the fix that most tables have is you just can't use the spell. Complex game mechanics may be a lot to wrap your head around, but when they are well designed, it leads to excellent game balance and an easier time identifying unbalanced aspects of the game, which ultimately makes those items easier to bring back into the general realm of what you want the game to do. But all of this brings me to the last thing I'd like to say about the advantages of mechanical complexity in TTRPGs, which is mechanical complexity leads to longer games. I joked about this at the very start of this video, but sometime around Christmas of this year, my actual home Pathfinder game is probably going to hit level 14. And that stands out to me because, well, I've never been part of a D&D 5e game that went to level 14. Now, to be fair, I don't play as much D&D 5e as I do Pathfinder, but it is also pretty well known in the gaming community that after about level 13, D&D 5e's balance gets thrown off really, really badly, and it is often very difficult for game masters to keep a coherent story going because the mechanics become too wild and too swingy. However, with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I've been able to do several very high-level one-shots and have those games run very smoothly, and now my main campaign has been going on long enough that it's actually going to hit level 14 very naturally, and for me as a game master, the game is running smoothly. It's going well, and I don't have any particular fears that when they hit that point that the game is suddenly going to spin wildly out of control. In a little bit of a strange twist, when you look at the mechanics of a game, when there is a lot of complexity, it actually allows for a lot of narrative growth that can naturally be sustained over a long period of time. Now, I do realize that there are limits to this argument because I have stated publicly on this channel that I am a storyteller who ran 3 different Mythic Pathfinder 1e games, and Mythic Pathfinder 1e is not balanced by any stretch of the imagination. But I can also say that 2 of those 3 Mythic games did run all the way to level 20 and Mythic 10 in both cases, meaning that there was a lot of story that I was able to get out of that very complex set of rules. So those are 5 quick examples of advantages that I think complex mechanics bring to TTRPGs. That is mechanical clarity, narrative depth, narrative creativity, game balance, and the overall length of your story. But there is one principle that kind of encompasses all 5 of these, and that is the benefits of mechanical complexity apply to both sides of the Game Master screen. The benefits and clarity make it easier for the Game Master to make calls about the rule, but it also makes it easier for players to interpret the different options that they encounter. A well-balanced game can be exciting for both storytellers and players, and all of those narrative hooks that I described from the complex mechanics of games like Pathfinder are something that both players and storytellers can sink their teeth into. So I do think it is worth noting that when we talk about mechanical complexity as a TTRPG design choice, that it is worth saying these benefits extend to everyone at the gaming table. There are benefits for player and game master alike. But let me turn this conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about mechanical complexity in TTRPGs, and what advantages do complex mechanics offer when a game designer like Paizo chooses to take that approach? Jump down to the comments section and let me know some of the thoughts you have, and by all means, feel free to offer some examples of positive mechanical complexity from games that are beyond the spheres of just Pathfinder and D&D, because like I've said, this conversation can easily extend to a wide variety of games. I'd love to hear some of the excellent examples that you've seen. I don't know exactly when I'm going to get around to Mathfinder Part 2, but I will tell you that the next script that I'm working on for this particular topic is the actual idea of TTRPGs as a story versus the idea of TTRPGs as a game, and what those 2 distinctions mean when we think about game design. So that's just a heads up for where the next portion of this series will be going, and hopefully that video will be up in a couple of weeks. If you have any good ideas for that, be sure to let me know. And if you have other ideas for topics that could be part of this series, definitely leave those suggestions as well. Don't forget to do all of the other YouTube stuff, like, share, subscribe, check out Discord, check out Patreon. Those links are in the video description. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.